Amongst the pantheon of summons who have graced the Final Fantasy franchise, Ifrit is one of the most venerable. Often appearing as a horned beast who would rain down fiery hell on those who dared oppose its might, Ifrit has been ever present as the franchise built out. But even though some core traits have remained, such as the association Ifrit has had with the fire element, when looking in more granular detail, we can see that there has been significant change over the years. And throughout this video, we're going to take you on an expansive journey where we'll explore how every single appearance of Ifrit has tied together to create something of legend. Prior to gracing the Final Fantasy franchise, Ifrit first appeared in relation to Islamic mythology, but not as a horned beast. Instead, Ifrit was referred to as a caste of winged creatures. They were malicious in nature and were related to the Jinn, supernatural creatures somewhere between humans and angels who were typically associated with air or wind and could dwell in inanimate objects like oil lamps. As a rebellious subclass of the Jinn, the Ifrit were more akin to demons, and their retributive nature was legendary, with stories of them punishing humans for any slights done against them by inflicting disease or bodily harm. This made the Ifrit quite dangerous, as they could be violent and wrathful, but they did not necessarily act out of evil, and sometimes they even performed the will of God. In some areas, they were believed to spawn from unnatural deaths like murders to get vengeance upon the perpetrator, and they were said to be formed of smoke and fire, which inspired part of their depiction in the Final Fantasy games. The other part came from the earliest editions of Dungeons & Dragons. In the tabletop game, the Ifriti were a class of beings from the elemental plane of fire, where they appeared as demonic beings, complete with horns. But, unlike in Islamic mythology, where they were a subclass of the Jinn, in Dungeons & Dragons, they were the sworn enemies of the Jinn. Shape-shifting powers, wish-granting, and fire attacks were within the repertoire of the Ifriti, and although they could be bound by cunning sorcerers, they were infamous for their dislike of servitude, their desire for revenge, their cruel nature, and their ability to mislead. When Final Fantasy III introduced the concept of summon magic, Ifrit was amongst the first 5 summon creatures made available for players to call forth, and it could be obtained after purchasing the Heatros spell from a vendor in the town of Reblito. In this initial Famicom version, when called by an evoker or sage, Ifrit either performed a single target heal to the party or would use a single target fire attack that roughly translated to Flames of Fury. When called by a summoner, however, Ifrit used Flames of Hell, or Hellfire, to deliver overwhelming fire damage to all enemies. But even though it was impressive, Ifrit was a mid-tier summon in terms of damage output. After summoning, it became clear that the Ifrit seen within Final Fantasy had only a loose connection to what had been established elsewhere. It now referred to an individual demonic beast with the power to command fire, as opposed to being a race of spirits made of smoke and fire. There was also no association with the Jinn, even though one did feature early on in Final Fantasy III as an antagonist who cursed the citizens of Sasane and Kazas. The small horns that adorn the skull of the Ifriti in Dungeons & Dragons were elongated, extended behind Ifrit's skull, and it wore sandals with strapping on the lower leg. The concept art from which this was based was drawn by Yoshitaka Amano. It showed Ifrit with a mustard-coloured body, black hair and brown horns, but the in-game representation was a mixture, as Ifrit had 3 different colour palettes to represent the 3 possible moves. Each had black hair, but the healing Ifrit had a green body with brown horns, the weaker offensive Ifrit had a whitish blue body and red horns, and the most powerful Ifrit had the mustard body with green horns. Final Fantasy IV served as Ifrit's introduction to Western audiences, but it condensed various aspects of the original appearance. Known as Jinn owing to a mistranslation, Ifrit was a horned beast with green skin and brown horns, but unlike the previous game, Ifrit now had purple hair as opposed to black hair. With summon magic isolated to only one individual, Rydia, the number of potential moves was reduced, and this saw Ifrit's healing and single target attacks removed. Hellfire was the move that remained, as did its application as a fire-based attack that damaged all targets, but in the Western version, this move was known as Jinn, again owing to a mistranslation. Based on damage output, Ifrit remained a mid-level spell, but the method of acquisition changed, as instead of being bought in a shop, Ifrit was made available to Rydia automatically when she rejoined the party as an adult, and this also made Ifrit a mandatory summon. In Final Fantasy V, Ifrit continued the visual trend, with the same colour configuration and clothes. But this time, Ifrit stood taller, with its arms by its head and legs almost crossed, not unlike the stereotypical pose for a genie or djinn. Ifrit was also given a role to play in the story, and in this regard, it could be found in the Library of the Ancients and then fought as a mandatory boss battle. During this encounter, Ifrit attacked with fire magic, but also used kicks, and displayed a weakness to ice attacks. Once defeated, Ifrit became a level 2 summon, and due to this being part of the story, acquisition was again mandatory. In addition to Ifrit's small role in the story, should the party have acquired the summon prior to encountering Ramuh in a random battle outside the town of Istory, then should Ifrit be used at the start of the battle without taking any other action beforehand, Ramuh would throw in the towel and lend his power automatically due to respect. When called upon in battle, Hellfire remained as the signature attack. This again dealt fire damage to all opposing foes, making Ifrit useful against fire-weak enemies, including Byblos, the final boss of the Library of the Ancients. But in relation to the other available summons, Ifrit was low tier by the end of the game, and this served as something of a regression in terms of Ifrit's combat prowess. Final Fantasy VI saw a huge expansion to the concept of summons, both in terms of the number available for players to call upon and their role within the story. In this regard, in addition to the previously established canon with Ramuh, Ifrit was also connected with Shiva. After venturing deep inside the Magitech research facility, the party learnt about the horrible experimentation that had been taking place on Espers. Discarded by Kefka, Ifrit and Shiva fought against the party as they were desperate to try and escape, but after sensing Ramuh, they stood down. During this fight, Ifrit would use variants of fire magic and displayed a near identical appearance from what had been seen within Final Fantasy IV and V. It was only after the fight, as Ifrit was acquired as a mandatory Esper, that we would see a slight deviation. This could again be chalked up to a mistranslation, but in the SNES and PlayStation versions of Final Fantasy VI, Ifrit no longer performed Hellfire when summoned. Instead, even though the move was still fire-based and would still damage all enemies, it was called Inferno by the localization team. As Final Fantasy ventured onto the PlayStation, many hallmarks were retained, but there was also some room for creative interpretation, and in this regard, we got to see a whole new side to Ifrit. Some aspects of the original concept resurfaced, such as the mustard-coloured body and brown horns, but the purple hair introduced in Final Fantasy IV was used instead of black hair from the original. Even though it may have been planned at some point, summons had their roles reduced within this particular story, as they were distilled into materia, and this allowed for a new method of acquisition, as instead of being purchased, learnt or fought against, Ifrit could just be found on the floor of the cargo ship after defeating Genova Birth. When called upon, Ifrit would use Hellfire, a move that still dealt fire damage to all enemies, but Ifrit was again one of the weakest summons available. And this aspect, as well as all of its visual elements, was then retained when Ifrit reappeared as a summon in Before Crisis. Final Fantasy Tactics represented something of a detour for the franchise, as Yasumi Matsuno and Hiroyuki Ito attempted to create something that was similar but also quite unique. Ifrit appeared as one of the available summons, but unlike Final Fantasy III or V, where summons could be used after purchasing or defeating them, in Final Fantasy Tactics, summons could be learnt by leveling up and spending these subsequent job points. And in this regard, Ifrit was one of the first and therefore one of the weakest summons available. Working along with the theme of creating something similar that was also unique, Ifrit was still a horned beast, but it saw the first appearance of a brown body. Ifrit also had brown hair, something that had not been seen before, but it did retain the standard brown horns that had been there since the beginning. Ifrit's combat application was also amended. There was still the standard association with fire, but we saw a new move called Infernal Blaze, which instead of damaging a single target or all targets, now affected a specific area of the map. Ifrit next appeared as a guardian force in Final Fantasy VIII, and this, for many, represents one of the quintessential appearances. Sticking with the brown body that had just been introduced in Final Fantasy Tactics, the design team mixed things up by introducing black horns and fiery hair. Ifrit was also given wrist guards and earrings to make up for the removal of clothing elsewhere. In relation to the story, Ifrit was encountered inside the Fire Cavern as part of a training exercise. This mirrored Final Fantasy V and VI, where Ifrit would need to be fought as part of the story and then acquired as a mandatory guardian force. This took place right at the start of the game as a precursor to the Seed examination, and Ifrit would make note if Shiva had already been acquired, building upon the narrative connection between the two summons. When used, Ifrit returned to the standard application as Hellfire would rain down fire elemental damage to every enemy, but due to its early acquisition, Ifrit was once again one of the weakest GFs available. Despite Final Fantasy IX serving as a tribute to everything that had come before, Ifrit had one of the most distinctive designs to date. It continued with the new theme of having a brown body, but it also featured brown hair, and we saw the first appearance of orange horns. Outside of that, Ifrit's physique was quite different, adopting a less humanoid appearance with accentuated forearms and a very defined hock, which would typically be found on quadrupedal mammals. Final Fantasy IX also introduced a new method of acquisition. After the party returned from the outer continent, Garnet could learn Ifrit from the Topaz Gemstone, which was received as a gift from Dr. Tot. But technically, Ifrit was auto-learnt as well, as Garnet already had the Eidolon within her. When called upon, true to form, Ifrit would scorch with a fire-based attack that would deal damage to all enemies, but there was again a deviation, as the English localization team chose to call the move Flames of Hell as opposed to the traditional Hellfire. By the time Final Fantasy X was in development, Square had created a multi-team development system. This meant that large parts of the team who worked on Final Fantasy VIII also worked on Final Fantasy X, and it led to Ifrit adopting a very similar aesthetic, but it wasn't identical, as Ifrit now had ankle guards and a necklace. Due to the expanded role of summons, which required more focus on combat application, Ifrit was granted a new move called Meteor Strike. This was a non-elemental attack that bypassed Protect, and it was joined by the classic finisher, Hellfire. With these elements combined, even though Ifrit was still one of the weakest Aeons available, it was a reprisal of what we had seen in Final Fantasy III, where Ifrit could perform multiple moves. We also saw an interesting evolution. Often, Ifrit was only fought in relation to the party proving their worthiness to wield its power, but in Final Fantasy X, even though Ifrit was given to Yuna following her completion of Kilika Temple, there were still multiple fights against the Aeon via proxy, with some mandatory and some optional. It was also the first appearance of Dark Ifrit, who could be found at the entrance to Home in Bikanal Desert. When Ifrit then appeared in Final Fantasy X-2, there was no evolution, and for narrative reasons, Ifrit's role was diminished in significant fashion, with the Aeon only appearing as a boss at the end of Chapter 3. Ifrit next appeared in an unlikely source, an anime produced by Gonzo on behalf of Square. This was called Final Fantasy Unlimited, and perhaps due to the nature of the medium, it saw radical changes made to Ifrit's appearance. Ifrit now had a flaming body, complete with flaming horns and flaming hair, and even though Ifrit did not perform a named move when summoned, there was still a very clear association with fire, and the summon's legacy was retained. The next chronological appearance of Ifrit came in Final Fantasy XI. Acting as the first MMO in the franchise, Final Fantasy XI saw numerous details fleshed out in comparison to what had been seen with previous iterations, and in this regard, summons saw massive benefit. Instead of being pawns who were mere gameplay devices, summons were now integrated into the story, and Ifrit was one of the 6 sleeping gods who resided in proto-crystals that were scattered throughout Vana'diel. This piece of narrative exposition saw Ifrit related to Ramuh and Shiva once again, something that had not happened since Final Fantasy VI, and it was through these proto-crystals that the power of the elemental gods housed within could be harnessed, but not without fighting first. In the case of Ifrit, Ifrit Prime would need to be defeated as part of the Trial by Fire questline, and upon doing so, summoners would gain access to a powerful ally. And that was because, unlike almost every prior iteration, Ifrit wasn't just part of the proverbial furniture. Instead, it was one of the strongest summons available, capable of dealing massive amounts of damage, especially to enemies who were weak against fire. To assist with this damage dealing, this version of Ifrit had the most expansive list of moves to date, but in an interesting twist, Hellfire was not one of them. Instead, this iteration of Ifrit made reference to Inferno, a move previously only seen in Final Fantasy III if we're chalking the appearance in Final Fantasy VI up to a mistranslation, and Meteor Strike, which had been introduced in Final Fantasy X and was now Ifrit's strongest move. The other moves were a rather rudimentary punch, some high-level fire spells, and two new additions called Burning Strike and Flaming Crush. Due to the nature of the experience, some of these moves only affected a single target, but much like in Final Fantasy Tactics, the more expansive moves would only target an area as opposed to guaranteeing damage against all enemies. What was also intriguing about this iteration of Ifrit was the design. Its body was brown at its core, and it also had black horns, but layered over the top were fiery red scales acting as a type of armour. All of these traits, alongside the addition of the ability to fight against Ifrit as either a group or solo via trial-sized trial by fire, made this particular iteration quite comprehensive. But what followed afterwards was a period of experimentation for Ifrit, as appearances deviated from what had been established or just served as subtle odes. It would have been easy for Ifrit's appearance in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance to serve as a continuation to what had been seen in Tactics, and in many regards it was, but from a visual perspective the developers chose to add something of a flourish. Ifrit still featured a brown body and brown hair, and its appearance as a horned beast was retained. Ifrit was adorned with a full coat of golden armour and had hooves complete with woolly legs. Unlike every prior game, in Tactics Advance, Ifrit could be summoned upon equipping a weapon, and in this case it was the Guard Staff. Once enough AP had been accumulated, Ifrit would then be mastered and could be summoned without equipping the staff, even when using another job. Nonetheless, Ifrit was of decent strength and was mid-tier in terms of performance, something that had not been the case since Final Fantasy IV. This particular iteration of Ifrit was then carried through to many of the properties that spawned from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, including Final Fantasy Tactics A2, the Crystal Defenders, and Final Fantasy Tactics S. But when it came to the release of Final Fantasy XII, even though it was also part of Evilesian lore, Ifrit did not appear, at least in the traditional sense. This represented a first, as up until this point in the franchise, even though there had been a few exceptions, such as Mystic Quest and earlier iterations of the Saga and Mana franchises, after Final Fantasy III, Ifrit had featured in every single Final Fantasy release and had done so as a summoned beast. Final Fantasy XII broke this tradition by relegating the traditional Final Fantasy summons to references, and in this regard, Ifrit appeared alongside Shiva and Leviathan as airships that were part of the 8th Fleet. It would have been assumed, based on there being no Ifrit present in Final Fantasy XII, that its sequel would follow suit, but Ifrit appeared in Revenant Wings amongst an abundance of Espers. But even though Ifrit had appeared in numerous Ivalice games prior to Revenant Wings, there was no reference to what had come before. Ifrit was now covered in crimson red fur and had more in common with a Yeti than the feral beast we'd come to expect. This iteration was also unique, as it represented the first appearance of a black body and white horns. Ifrit could be bought using the new Orosite system, and it was classified as a rank 3 fire-type melee summon. This made Ifrit a high-tier Esper that could cause significant damage through the use of Burning Strike, a move previously only seen in Final Fantasy XI, and its special attack, Hellfire. There was also a nice bonus added here, as even though Hellfire was an area of effect move, it also affected targets with slow. Throughout the game, Ifrit could also be fought multiple times as a boss, a nice reference back to Final Fantasy X, where acquisition did not depend on victory in a skirmish. Ifrit also had its first official connection with the Jinn, if we're chalking up Final Fantasy IV as an error, as Jinn appeared as a weaker variant of the fire-type summon, and they fought alongside Ifrit in numerous missions. Ifrit next appeared in Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. This was an interesting iteration, because even though before Crisis had taken direct inspiration from what had appeared in Final Fantasy VII, the development team working on Crisis Core saw fit to ignore what had come before and create a brand new Ifrit. It saw the mustard coloured body replaced with a standard brown body and fiery hair instead of purple hair. This Ifrit also had a pronounced hawk, as seen in Final Fantasy IX, and to coincide with this, we saw Hu's return, something that had been introduced in Tactics Advance. Wrist guards were also visible, as in Final Fantasy VIII and X, but to take it one step further, this particular Ifrit featured small pieces of armour on its shoulders and across its chest. Throughout Crisis Core, Ifrit could be fought against numerous times. The first encounter came at the behest of Genesis, and the second came via a mission called Rematch with Ifrit, and it was upon completion of this second mission that Ifrit would be made available, and when summoned, Ifrit would use Hellfire as its DMW attack, but its power was dependent on the level of the attack. When being fought against, Ifrit could also use a second move called Flame Shot, which hadn't ever been seen before. It represented an interesting twist, and the notion of producing creative interpretations of Ifrit did not slow down. Even though Ifrit had been established in the original version of Final Fantasy IV, for the remake there were wholesale changes, at least from a visual perspective. Ifrit now featured a fiery body, complete with accompanying horns and hair. We had only ever seen this before in Final Fantasy Unlimited, and I'd like to think that in some small way the developers were inspired by the anime. Everything else was a direct reference to the original. Ifrit was auto-learned and mandatory, and when called upon would perform Hellfire, a strong move that classified Ifrit as a mid-tier summon. Final Fantasy IV The After Years then made reference to Ifrit from both the original SNES version of Final Fantasy IV and the DS version, depending on which version you chose to play. Every other trait was kept intact, but there were some slight tweaks made. Ifrit could now only be acquired after being bested in combat, and it also appeared as an unbeatable boss in the context of the story, and in this regard, it also meant that you could fight Ifrit multiple times. Ifrit next surfaced in Dissidia Final Fantasy, a game that pulled from various sources to celebrate the franchise. It saw the past of Ifrit celebrated too, with Final Fantasy IV Ifrit being called upon when doing a manual summon, and Final Fantasy X Ifrit called upon when doing an automatic summon. It was then much the same in its sequel, Duodecim, but owing to the inclusion of Yuna, Ifrit from Final Fantasy X also made an appearance, and it could make use of Meteor Strike and Hellfire just like in the original game. For the next numbered Final Fantasy, Ifrit was again kept on the sidelines, as Final Fantasy XIII only featured a loose reference. Ifrit appeared during the Pomta Sancta event, where it served as an eidolon of the Pulseless Sea that was attempting to destroy Cocoon. As part of this story, Ifrit squared off against Ramuh, who was representing a Cocoonless Sea, and this served as a nice ode to previous games where the pair had a connection. From a visual perspective, it was similar to what had been seen within Final Fantasy VIII and X, with a brown body and fiery hair, but the horns were now metallic, with fire literally coming out of the top. Ifrit's next appearance also served as a nice ode, but it was a much more comprehensive one, as the team who worked on Final Fantasy Dimensions had previously worked on The After Years. It meant Ifrit had a similar visual design, although its body was made brown this time. Ifrit would need to be fought and defeated in the Cave of Perfervidity in order to be acquired, and during this fight, and when used as a summon after, Ifrit would make use of Hellfire, which displayed the standard application. But Ifrit also had a new move in the boss battle. This was called Heat Up, and made Ifrit stronger and faster, and allowed it to use Hellfire. The next major iteration of Ifrit came in Final Fantasy XIV, and just like the previous MMO, Ifrit was again ingrained into the game's lore. This time, Ifrit was the primal worshipped by the Amaljar Beast tribe, and they planned to use its savagery to defend themselves against the Garlean Empire. As part of this process, the tribe would kidnap individuals so that they could be tempered by Ifrit and turned into worshippers. Owing to their fanaticism, they attempted to summon Ifrit multiple times, but it was defeated each and every time. Perhaps because of its association with the Amaljar, Ifrit was given a more lizard-like appearance in this particular game and adopted the fiery colour scheme, similar to what had been seen within the Final Fantasy IV Remake, but with much more detail. Ifrit could be fought various times in the Bowl of Embers, and with each increase in difficulty, the breadth of actions taken by Ifrit was increased. Amongst the selection were numerous odes back to Final Fantasy XI, such as Inferno, Meteor Strike, Burning Strike and Flaming Crush, This iteration also introduced plenty of new moves such as Eruption, Crimson Cyclone, Incinerate, and Infernal Nails, which was particularly harsh if the summoned nail was not destroyed. Some of these moves could then be used when summoning Ifrit to aid in battle, but even though Hellfire was used by Ifrit when appearing as an antagonist, this particular move was not used under instruction from the player. Inferno was instead installed as its most powerful move. Nonetheless, when looking at all of the elements combined, alongside Final Fantasy X and XI, this was one of the most comprehensive iterations of Ifrit to date. Final Fantasy Type 0 continued a common trend, as even though there was no chronological association with Crisis Core, the two games were worked on by the same team, and the model used in both games was near identical, perhaps to speed up production. But that was where the similarities stopped, as this particular iteration of Ifrit was one of, if not the most expansive we had ever seen in the franchise. Within the context of the game's story, Ifrit was associated with the Dominion of Rubrum, and was often used to help repel invasions from rival factions. But what made this particular iteration of Ifrit so comprehensive was that Ifrit was no longer a singular entity. Instead, Ifrit was a class of Eidolon, and each variant of Ifrit had a different name, as well as different abilities. The most common moves were Eruption, which had just been introduced in Final Fantasy XIV, Meteor Strike, and a new move called Blazing Strike. This could be used by Ifrit, Firebrand, Rubicante, and Vulcan, but Calamity was quite different, as due to its specialism as a close quarters brawler variant, it could only use a move called Flaming Fist. The Ignis variant was then the opposite, unable to fight close range, but devastating at long range due to its use of Meteor Mash, an upgrade of Meteor Strike, and Hellfire. Each of these summons was given to the player after completing a specific objective or speaking to a certain individual, and they all had strengths and weaknesses, such as innate regen, longer summon times, and berserk status. But even though there were so many different variants, no version of Ifrit was ever fought, a very uncommon occurrence. Final Fantasy Explorers arrived a few years later, and Ifrit was one of the 12 summons available for players to call upon. Also known as the Fire Jinn, Ifrit could be fought as a boss 2 times and could be used by the player if encased in Magicite. Across the various fights, and when summoned, Ifrit had access to Hellfire, but also used Flaming Fist, which had just been introduced in Type 0, and 2 new moves, Fiery Advance and Conflagrant Wall. Ifrit also built upon the visual design of Final Fantasy VIII and X, returning to a beast-like appearance with brown body and fiery hair, but with much more in the way of armor plating. This iteration of Ifrit was then resurfaced for Final Fantasy Explorers Force, but a similar approach was not adopted for the follow-up to Final Fantasy Dimensions. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 arrived a few years after the original game, and although there were some similarities, it was very much its own experience. Due to creative liberties afforded to the development staff, this saw Ifrit take on a rather different form, as instead of being a horned beast, Ifrit was a horned humanoid with white hair and a fiery tail. In this form, Ifrit appeared as a story boss inside the Ifritia mines, but also appeared during boss-specific events, and when fought and summoned, Ifrit would use Hellfire and other standard fire spells. Dimensions 2 also featured numerous variants of Ifrit. Dark Ifrit we'd seen before, but there was also Neo Ifrit and God Ifrit, which was more traditional in appearance, albeit with way more horns. Each had their quirks and introduced some new traits. Dark Ifrit, for example, could use a brand new move called Evil Hellfire. This dealt fire damage to all enemies, but instead of it being just a single attack, it dealt damage 3 times. Mobius continued the trend of pushing the established norms of Ifrit, but it also offered balance by making reference to classic variants. As Mobius was developed by some of the people who worked on Final Fantasy X, they chose to have this particular iteration of Ifrit return to help the Warrior of Light, but it also appeared as a boss who could be fought against multiple times and even had a collaboration event with Shiva. When fought, Ifrit used Meteor Strike and Hellfire just like the original game, but could also use Eruption and a brand new move called Backdraft. It was also possible to summon the Final Fantasy VII version of Ifrit, and this was intriguing, as instead of being Fire Elemental, the card was associated with the Light element. Mobius also introduced some more unique takes on Ifrit. The standard version of Ifrit was still a horned beast, but the design saw the first appearance of a metallic body, and it featured hair that looked more like tentacles. Extreme Ifrit then built upon the Final Fantasy X model but changed the body colour to black, and Extreme Ifrit X built upon this further, exaggerating the horns and giving Ifrit much more fur. We also saw the first iteration of a female Ifrit via the Ifrita card, but instead of being a horned beast, Ifrita was a horned humanoid, much like we had just seen in Final Fantasy Dimensions 2. After all of this change, the developers of Brave Exvius decided to keep things a bit more traditional. Ifrit adopted the fiery appearance seen in Final Fantasy IV Remake and XIV, adding its own unique spin by giving Ifrit a bit more armour alongside some wrist guards, and after being found in the Infernal Hollow, Ifrit could be acquired after being bested in combat. Due to being acquired so early, Ifrit was one of the weakest espers available to use, but still provided utility against fire-weak enemies, especially when using its ultimate move, Hellfire. Ifrit next appeared in Final Fantasy Dissidia Arcade and NT as one of the summons that players could use to try and turn the tide in battle. Unlike the two previous Dissidia games, which called upon established versions of Ifrit, Dissidia Arcade featured an original take on the venerable summon and would call back some long-forgotten traits. It saw Ifrit sport a mustard-coloured body, something that had not happened since Final Fantasy VII, and brown hair, another trait that had fallen by the wayside in favour of fiery hair, although Ifrit did still have fiery hair on its wrists. When called upon, Ifrit would be able to damage the opposition team by using Meteor Strike, and its ultimate move was again Hellfire, but when fought against, Ifrit could use Conflagrant Wall, a move that had only ever been seen before in Final Fantasy Explorers. This version of Ifrit could then be called upon in Opera Omnia after it was obtained during Chapter 2.
It was Kupo-Po, and not Kupo!
Who's there?
Acting as a tribute game, World of Final Fantasy created an expansive iteration of Ifrit that made reference to many aspects from the past. Its visual design was similar to what was established in Final Fantasy X, and Ifrit was given a much bigger role in the story, appearing alongside Ramuh and Shiva as one of the 7 Pleiad, powerful mirages who looked to guide Ren and Lan on their quest. After jumping through enough hoops, Ifrit could be acquired as a mirage, and when used in combat, various fire-based moves were seen, including Hellfire. Numerous variants of Ifrit also featured, with Ifrita appearing as another female iteration. The EX dungeons also introduced a black and white variant family, with Gleefrit appearing as the most evolved form. But if we're talking about strong appearances of Ifrit, then Final Fantasy XV needs to take centre stage, as the summon saw its role in Final Fantasy meta evolved.
Stay cool. He's gonna bring the heat.
Even though Noctis could acquire numerous summons, Ifrit was not one of them. Instead, he served as one of the main antagonists. Having turned his back on the other Astrals in the past, Ifrit ended up as their enemy, and was a source of ire across the land before being subjugated by Arden and subsequently used as his minion to help defeat Somnus, before then being asked to fulfill the same role against Noctis. Perhaps because of this change, the decision was taken to have Ifrit shed the classic beast-like appearance in favour of the horned humanoid that had started to become a more regular trait. This saw Ifrit have no physical association with fire, as his body was pale and his horns were made of bone. He did still have brown hair, however, and wore the classic wrist guards. Within the context of the main game, Ifrit was fought against right at the end, and outside of standard melee attacks, he would use a move called the Flames of Hell, which had not been seen since Final Fantasy IX. This could have perhaps been chalked up again to a mistranslation, but in Episode Arden, in addition to Meteor Strike, Ifrit could also use Hellfire. It represented a significant change for Ifrit, and when throwing in the opportunity for multiple fights across the main game, Episode Arden and Comrades, it was a comprehensive appearance. The most recent iteration of Ifrit has been seen within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it appeared as one of the summons available to players after being gifted by Jessie, as well as a boss in the Shinra Combat Simulator. Due to its source, this version of Ifrit had a lot of similarities with what had been seen within the original Final Fantasy VII, so it featured a mustard-coloured body, brown horns and purple hair, but it was also given fiery hair and wrist guards, something that did not feature as part of the original design, but had been adopted in Crisis Core. Even though Ifrit was low tier in the original game, owing to the nature of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it was upgraded to being one of the strongest summons available, and when called upon, would use Hellfire as its ultimate move, but it could also use two other moves, Radiant Plume, previously seen in Final Fantasy XIV, and Crimson Dive. And that plants us at an interesting place as we look forward to Final Fantasy XVI. We don't know all that much at the moment, but we do know that Ifrit will have a prominent role within the story and could well have a connection with Phoenix. We also know that from a visual perspective, it's somewhat iterating on what we saw in Final Fantasy XIV, as even though the lizard-like appearance isn't there, it's all about the fire. As we learn more throughout 2021, it's going to be fascinating to see which of the many, many established traits they choose to incorporate into this new vision for Ifrit. And I don't know about all of you, but I can't wait to see what happens. But with that brief look at Ifrit from Final Fantasy XVI, we are at the end of this evolutionary topic, and we hope you have enjoyed this retrospective view of how Ifrit has appeared and subsequently evolved throughout the Final Fantasy franchise. Unlike the previous evolution videos, we adopted a different approach this time around, as we looked at the evolution from a chronological perspective and dove into pretty much every single appearance of the summon, no matter how big or small. We hope you've appreciated this new take, but it would be great to hear what you thought, and if you enjoyed it, then please feel free to throw us a like. We'd also love to hear what summon you'd like us to tackle next, so be sure to let us know in the comments. Make sure you subscribe as well, as outside of publishing more evolutionary topics, we are also hoping to deliver our first documentary style video within the next month. It will focus on the complete history of Square, and we are so excited to share it with you all. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Eckham, Logan Nijay and Benjamin Snow, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.